Law enforcement around the world is looking to do whatever it can to prevent a suicide attack, but are there proven methods that work? I put that question to national security analyst Scriven King.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are tons of methods that we use to prevent suicide bombings. There's numerous devices such as ion scanners or mass spectrometers. We use canine detection or explosive detection dogs. There are a number of things that we can do to detect and ultimately mitigate explosive devices.
What do police look for and try and identify in a crowd to spot a suicide bomber?
Sure. One of the things that we tend to look for are things that are out of the ordinary. That can be a vehicle that's not supposed to be there. It could be a person that's unseasonably dressed for the occasion. For instance, in Istanbul, the attackers were noted for wearing heavy garments in Turkey in the middle of the summer. Certainly something that would be unusual considering it was over 100 degrees that particular day.
How do you stop a suicide bomber? Obviously a key question, but then the other question, if you manage to detect a suicide bomber, what do you do next? Is there a fail-safe approach?
You know, there are several things that we can do to kind of mitigate that. And I stress mitigation over prevention a lot because prevention assumes that we can catch everything. Mitigation assumes that even when it arrives, we can deal with it. And that involves not only just dampening the impact, but ultimately creating an environment that's unappetizing for the bad guys. So for instance, one of the things that we can do post-attack is we can eliminate or we can increase the number of egress points for people who need to evacuate. That's a huge concern for us as we deal with crowds. The last thing we want to do is create another situation where people are in another situation where they're crowded and potentially a target that's attractive.
It's interesting. I was reading in this article, the International Association of Chiefs of Police had suggested that if an officer were to see somebody and suspect something, fire shots in the air. That way people would hit the deck. But then there's a Yale professor, Edward Kaplan, who did a study who said that actually that might be even worse, that people would then be there in the situation. There might actually be more casualties. So I guess how you respond can be difficult, and what may seem like the logical step may not be.
Yeah, evacuating people out of an area post-attack it's a very tricky proposition because we're dealing in an area now where we're seeing explosives being used as a means of funneling crowds into a particular location and then being encountered by active shooters to kind of eliminate the stragglers, if you will. And so it's important for us to get the evacuation portion done right, because if we can increase the number of egress points, the number of exits, for instance, at a location, we can eliminate the amount of congregation or congestion that occurs during evacuations.
And combating suicide bombers, how would you compare that to traditional terror attackers? I mean, are there differences? Is one more difficult to address than the other?
That's a very good question. I think we have a tendency to look at suicide bombers as being different than active shooters, and in some ways they are. It's important to understand that with active shooters, there tends to be a little less planning, if you will, in the attack, unless there's going to be an explosive device. With suicide bombers, there's a lot more planning that's involved because they have to be able to solve the problem of access control. How do they get inside of the secure area, and how do they detonate that explosive to make it happen? That's traditionally where we see the greatest difficulty with suicide bombers versus active shooters.
Scriven King, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, sir.